Chapter 19 The End of an Old Feud. Almost every day there were more talks with the king. I explained the strategic position of his country, its resources and possibilities. I discussed the future of Port St. John's, and as an old seaman, offered my advice as to improvements in the little harbor. I extolled the civilizing effects of religion, for although I was not religious myself, I was in favor of establishing a mission for the natives. Most of my arguments, however, were on the subject of education, and I made him understand that if the Pondos were ever to be a great people, they would have to be given instruction in the rudiments, with opportunity for higher education. Above all, I extolled nautical science and the discipline of the sea. The king was more than willing to help me, and told me of a valley 20 miles from Kilkenny, where I might have all the land I wished for building schools. Early one morning we saddled our horses and started out to see the valley and the site for the proposed schools. After a 2 hours' ride, we entered a rocky ravine, along which our horses were forced to move single file. We went downward toward a river, whose blue-green surface showed now and again through the vines and foliage. When we at last reached the river's brink, I was aware of a noise like that of distant thunder. I asked Mtenzo the source of the sound, and he explained that we were approaching the Titsta waterfall, which is the highest in Cape Colony. We followed a narrow beaten path along the river bank, through a gorge bright with flowers. The current rushed along ahead of us, and became swifter and swifter as we advanced. At last, upon rounding a bend, we found ourselves at the crest of the fall. I have seen Niagara, Yosemite, the falls of the Zambezi, and many more, but none that were as beautiful as this. The river at this point was of a good size, and its waters fell in a sheer, unbroken drop of 375 feet, thundering onto the rocks below, and dancing high into the clear air. The valley beneath us stretched away for miles, with the river winding through it like a silver ribbon. The floor of the valley was a green meadow. The hills enclosing it were clothed with forests. It made us excited and heady to look over the jagged cliff at the dancing water below. Our horses moved nervously on the narrow, rocky promontory overlooking the fall, and watched the river with frightened eyes. But Segafacoo rode his fine black mare to within a few inches of the rim, and sat as proudly as a feudal baron viewing his domain. It was as if this man and horse were unmoved by the petty emotions and fears of the lesser individuals of their respective species. We took a path that went around the cliff, and by easy descent came to the valley floor. It must have taken us several miles to descend the 375 feet that the water took at one bound. When we were at last below, looking upward, the sound of falling water was almost deafening. Some 100 feet from the fall itself, the foaming, turbulent stream subsided into a quiet pool of great depth, where bright fish of every size darted. As several of the boys were armed with spears, It was suggested that we rest for a few hours and fish. We fished and speared half the morning, catching all that we wanted for the crawl. Then we stripped and swam, sporting in the cool water and diving downward toward the bottom, where the greater fish lurked in the shadows. Below the pool, the river ran away in a rapid stream, some 60 or 70 feet wide, following the valley toward the sea. When we had dressed, we mounted and rode down along its banks toward the point the king had chosen for the building of schools and a mission. As I turned and looked back, the waterfall and the cliff curving away on either side seemed backdrops to a magnificent stage, a stage fit for any drama man might conceive, and I wondered if that drama were not about to be enacted. Could the stage setting be too stupendous that was to form the background for the rehabilitation of Africa and the foundation of an Ethiopian empire? What cities might spring up in this valley? What temples flower like mimosa bloom? When we had ridden 3 or 4 miles, the sound of the waterfall was again like distant thunder, very drowsy and soothing. At last the king turned his horse from the river and told us to follow him. We ascended a gradual slope until we had risen some 40 feet and were 400 feet from the river bank. "This is yours," he said, and with a sweep of his hand indicated a large level meadow high enough to be dry even in the rainy season, and broad enough to accommodate scores of buildings. I thanked him from the bottom of my heart, realizing that very soon my schools would stand where now we saw nothing but grass billowing in the wind. We returned to Kilkenny, where papers were signed by the king and his councillors giving the African Methodist Church 1,400 morgens of land for the purpose of building schools and a mission. The very next day I went to the under-chief, who controlled the valley and arranged for materials and labor. I decided to live with an English trader and his mulatto wife, who owned a small station within 2 miles of my concession. They took me willingly. The chief and his men worked industriously, gathering material, and within 2 weeks 3 buildings were underway. I had drawn the plans for them myself, and they were quite unlike any architecture in South Africa. The floors and the lower walls were of a good grade of stone, which we quarried from one of the cliffs near the waterfall. The upper walls, which were very well protected by the wide eaves, were of adobe brick, which I taught the natives to make from the fine clay of the valley. The timbers were hand-hewn from the nearby forest. I had just become thoroughly absorbed in my work when I was summoned to Kilkenny by a messenger who galloped up to me on a foam-flecked horse. I mounted and followed him to the King's Crawl as fast as I could ride. Long before we got there, we could hear drums beating, and from every corner of the horizon see the warriors gathering. When we reached the kraal, I dismounted and hurried to the king's hut. The councillors were assembled, and the king was very grave. I found that war with the Pondo Messis was almost inevitable. There are only 2 things which are of sufficient importance to cause the natives to go to war. One is their land, the other their women. Several of the Pondo Messi boys from the tribe northwest of Pondo land had eloped with Pondo girls and carried them away to their mountainous country. In the native code of morals, this is a heinous crime, and may only be avenged with blood. Practically all the counselors were in favor of immediate attack, and the fever for battle was rampant in the kraal. Even as we talked, the army was forming into the typical formation, its battle line arranged in the shape of a bull's horns, with the men facing the enemy's country. Even as we talked, the warriors were swinging their asagas, dancing the war dance, and working themselves to a tremendous emotional pitch. I saw that it would be a superhuman feat to cool the anger of these thousands of people, but I was determined to try. I asked for a chance to speak, and the king granted me the privilege. Mtenzo stood by my side and translated rapidly into Pondo. I said, "The Pondo messes have done you a great wrong, and you must be avenged. They have stolen your girls and carried them up into the mountains. You know but one answer to such an insult: war. You will attack, and there will be a great battle. Men will be killed, and huts will be burned. But this should not deter brave warriors. You will advance with asagas in hand and descend upon the Pondo messes. In your absence, the mealies will rot in the fields, and your unwatched herds will wander into other countries. But that is nothing when you think of the glory of victory. You will fight a great fight. Many women will be widowed. You will continue to do battle until every warrior in one of the armies is dead or captured, or until the Pondo or the Pondo Messi king lies dead. Then the women of the unfortunate tribe who lost in battle will spend their lives in a foreign land under a foreign king. These are small sacrifices. However, when you dream of vengeance, your law is your law, and I will not try to dissuade you. But wait, what is it you would avenge? Intermarriage between two tribes. Are you so sure the Pondo messes are another tribe? Some of your old men can remember when the two tribes were one. They can remember when there was no feud. They can remember when these men, whom you are about to kill, sat beside you at the feast and aided you in battle against your common enemies. The same blood that runs in your veins runs in theirs. These boys and girls would merely reunite two tribes that should be one. Still, if you must have vengeance, those people were by no means invulnerable to logic, and one by one the counselors were convinced that war should be averted. By a lucky coincidence, an embassy of Pondo messes arrived while I was still talking. Sigao Faku, having gained implicit confidence in my ability, placed in my hands the great trust of coming to terms and avoiding war. I addressed them before Sigao Faku and his counselors, and tried to show them the great necessity of coming to terms. The palaver lasted all that day, and the next. Finally I said, "We have talked long enough. King Sigao Faku will keep peace under these conditions. You must send the young men together with their stolen wives back to Pondo land, where they will work for their father-in-law and become Pondos, dropping their formal tribal affiliations. You must bring Labola of 100 head of cattle and 100 head of goats to pacify Sagafaku and his people, that this old feud may die. You must agree never again to insult or fight with the Pondos. If you will not submit to these terms, we will advance with our army and wipe you off the face of the earth." The Pondomeses gathered together and talked and argued. One great warrior was all for fighting. Every few minutes he would wave his arms and howl defiance at all things Pondo. However, the older men of the embassy realized that our terms were very liberal and that it would be wise to accept. That evening they came to Sagafaku and promised to comply with all his terms if their king found them suitable. The next morning they mounted and left for their own country. I stayed at Kalkini for a week to make sure that all the warriors departed. By the end of the week, the Pondomesi boys and their wives arrived, driving before them the herd of cattle and goats. Thus an old feud, which had smoldered for years, and had on several occasions burst into angry flame, came to an end. War had been averted by a miracle, and a firm foundation for friendship laid where only hatred had existed before. The next morning I returned to my schools and recommenced work upon the buildings in earnest. I had been working several hours when I became the victim of a most peculiar attack. Great packs of Scotch collies who have gone wild roam this country like wolves, pulling down whatever game they come upon. I had left the laborers and had walked to the far side of one of the buildings when I saw one of these packs rushing down upon me. I was alone and unarmed. It was a moment for fast thinking. By great good fortune, a big hoe that had been used in mixing clay was leaning against the building. This I grasped and held before me, awaiting the attack. The leader bounded into the hoe with such violence that he fell back unconscious. The rest closed in, snapping and snarling. I backed myself against the building and swung left and right, but the dogs still came on, springing for my throat. I continued to fight them off, but where one dog fell, another took his place. In a moment the natives heard the uproar and hurried to my assistance. They beat off the infuriated animals with their knob carries, but not before one of the dogs had ripped an ounce of flesh from the calf of my right leg. Chapter 20. We hunt a man-eating lion. Some days later, I was again called to Kalkini. A Pondo messenger had just arrived, begging aid from the Pondos. His people would never have asked their neighbors for help had it not been that differences between the two tribes had just been adjusted. The occasion of the plea was a lion hunt. A wicked old man-eater had been coming down out of the Stormberg Mountains for years to kill the Pondomesi children and carry them away. On a number of occasions, attempts had been made to capture him, but the crafty old rascal had always made his escape to his almost impenetrable mountain retreat. In his last attack, he had killed the chief's favorite child. The tribe was determined to capture the lion at any cost. Sagafaku had sent for me to aid in the hunt, promising that work would go forward on the buildings during my absence. He realized that the only honorable thing we could do, considering the recent truce, was to help the weaker tribe. Much to the messenger's joy, the king sent 18 men on horseback and 5 of his 9 guns. Mtenzo, who was a good hunter, was given full charge of the expedition. I was glad to comply with the king's wish and accompany the hunters, as the past 3 weeks had been strenuous and I stood in need of diversion. I took with me an English army rifle, a shotgun, and revolvers which I had brought from the Pedro Gorino. We equipped ourselves for a 10 days' journey, and when all was ready, mounted our horses and set forth. For many hours we rode through a garden-like country, dotted with small clumps of trees. It was sunny weather, and not a cloud in the sky. About the middle of the afternoon, Mtenzo shot a buck, which had started up before us, and one of the native boys slung the carcass up behind him on his horse. By night we had come to the St. John's River, and here we made our camp. At this point the river was fordable, the horses being able to wade, except in mid-channel, where they were forced to swim for a few yards. Farther down the river, nearer the coast, it became a slow, meandering stream with heavy subtropical vegetation on either side. Farther above us, it was rapid, swift, and treacherous. From our camp, we could see the massive, rugged country about the Stormberg Mountains. For our evening meal, we had mealies. If we had been at home in Kilkenny, we should have added beef or chicken or goat's meat to the half sack of corn. Instead, we dressed the buck and the birds we had shot during the day and cooked them with the grain in a great iron pot. The next day brought us higher into the foothills. We were following the middle branch of the St. John's River, and we rode for miles along the bank of the rushing stream. Sometimes it fell in waterfalls or tumbled in rapids down its rocky channel. Sometimes it moved more slowly through deep pools cut in the rocks. We were some 3,000 feet above sea level at this time, and the air was clear and bracing. The country was barren and dry, cut with gulches and gullies. We had to take care in places that the horses did not fall. I was particularly careful of my little mare, as she had been given to me by the king, and I was very fond of her. In the afternoon of the second day, we came into a little fertile valley, and there lay the kraal of the king of the Pondo Messis. These people had just enough contact with the outside world to respect church affiliations and European clothes. With either of these distinctions, your social rating was beyond question. Some of the natives had red handkerchiefs, some shirts, some shoes, or a necktie. The king had an almost complete outfit, and he strutted about proudly in his regalia. The more subtle indications of culture were lost on these people, but its outward manifestations affected them mightily. I was a messenger from King Sagao Faku, and Mtenzo was a preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So we were accorded a royal welcome. We were given the best house in the kraal, and feasted from morning to night. Our hut, like the others, was the shape of a beehive, built of wattles, mud, and sticks, with a grass roof. It had windows, and was some 30 feet in diameter. The floor was packed hard, and was almost as artistic as a floor of mosaic, as designs of a dozen varieties, complicated and perfect in their execution, had been wrought upon its surface. It was easy to see from these fantastic conceptions that the people were not only good craftsmen, but very imaginative as well. When we were presented to the king, he made a long speech. He thanked us for our willingness to help him in his hour of need, and he proceeded to explain what a benefit we were about to bestow upon his people. He told us that in the heart of this old lion lived the spirit of Gafu, a rival chief. When this chief was angry, he stirred the old rascal lion from within and made him steal the Pondo Messi children. He told us that if we killed the lion, Gafu would die also, and there would be no more war or trouble with his tribe. The king had never before mentioned this to his people, and when he finished speaking, there was a great excitement and much discussion. Most of the natives agreed that the king's theory explained nicely the perversion of the old beast. It put a new importance on the outcome of the hunt. For 2 days we stayed about the kraal, learning the history of the man-eater and all his habits. We were told how and where he made his kills, how often he came down out of the mountains, and in what direction he retreated. The land over which we were about to travel was too rough for the horses, so when we felt we were ready, we gathered together our forces, picked out the best dogs in the camp, and proceeded on foot. 7 of us were armed with guns. I had my 2 revolvers and a rifle. A son of the chief of the Pondo Messis carried my shotgun. Mtenzo and his 4 best Pondo boys carried Sagao Faku's 5 rifles, and the other 35 natives were armed with sticks, assegas, knob carries, and knives. We set forth early one morning, and soon came to the place where the chief's son had been killed. A small volcanic mound of black sand, a regular diamond prospect, still showed the marks of the struggle. The child had been carrying water from the watering place a half-mile beyond, and on his return had stopped to play in the fine sand. The lion, lying in wait in a clump of brush near the trail, had taken the child from the rear. There were still a few pieces of blood-stained clothing scattered about. We put the dogs' noses to these, and the ground about them. Suddenly, one wandering from the others picked up the scent. Then the whole pack, baying and howling, shot off across the barren country in the direction of the Stormberg Mountains. We followed at a trot, calling in the dogs whenever they got too far in advance. As we were crossing a karoo cut with ravines and dry water courses, we found it rough going. Only once during the afternoon did the dogs lose the scent. Their confusion gave us a much-needed chance to rest, and a half-hour for shooting lesser game. I shot several birds, and one of the boys got a blesbok. At last the trail was rediscovered, and we again hurried forward. When night overtook us, We were in a ravine through which a trickle of water ran. The tiny stream appeared and disappeared into the gravel again, as do so many creeks in this part of the country. We had gone up the gully several hundred yards when we came upon unmistakable indications that the lion had recently passed this way, and since it was dark and we were sure that we were on the right trail, we soon decided on a likely spot and made our camp. Cutting some dead wood from the mimosa growth along the watercourse, we started a fire, and having dressed and washed our blesbok doves and grouse, started them cooking. After we had eaten, we built other fires in a circle about us to keep the snakes away. The rapid pace over the rough country had tired us all, and we were soon asleep. When a lion gets so old that he can no longer take great springs, landing among herds of buck and killing them left and right with his terrible blows and slashes, he will sometimes take to eating human flesh. Often these man-eaters are very unkempt, ragged-looking old brutes, but they seem to have learned new lessons in strategy from their contact with human beings, and they are very hard to capture and kill. We realized the crafty nature of our prey, and the next morning we proceeded more carefully. We unleashed the dogs and set them on the trail again, but we did not let them run so far ahead, and we watched each bush and hiding place more closely than before. The scent was stronger here, and the dogs followed the trail with no trouble at all. I sought my rifle and revolvers, determined to get a shot if one offered. At noon we came to a water hole, and surprised 2 buck, which we shot for dinner. The natives had reached such a pitch of excitement about the old lion that they talked and laughed incessantly. They would scarcely stop to rest or eat, despite the fatiguing morning, but wished to be on the trail again, following the dogs. We were well up in the mountains now, and early in the afternoon. The country through which we were traveling became so rugged that we were forced to go single file. Mtenzo, whom we all acknowledged as the best shot, went first. I came second, and the rest of the boys filed along behind. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the dogs led us into a rocky gorge, with sheer walls rising on either side. A clear stream trickled over the uneven floor, and part of the time we were forced to wade up this stream because of the narrowness of the canyon. Suddenly we heard the dogs go crazy up ahead. We hurried around a sharp bend and found ourselves in a little natural amphitheater with high rocky walls and no possible entrance except the pass in which we now stood. Mtenzo, who had entered a few seconds before, had shouted, "There he is!" By the time I reached his side, however, there was no lion in sight, only 3 of our dogs ripped wide open and groveling and howling near a clump of bushes on the far side of the enclosure. The rest of the pack were cowering back and trembling like leaves. No one but Mtenzo had seen the man-eater, but there was no doubt that we had him cornered. We decided that this must be his home and the place he had been hiding these many years while he preyed upon the Pondomesis. We could have rushed the bush and killed him, but we decided on a safer and surer course, climbing up the steep walls of the amphitheater to the plateau surrounding it. We stationed our men every 20 feet, with the 7 guns equidistant, and hid ourselves over the edge to wait. About sunset we were rewarded. The old monarch crept forth, cautiously at first, then very boldly. He yawned, stretched, and made his way down to the stream to drink. We waited until he had his fill, and then, as he started back for the bush, Mtenzo gave us the sign, and we let him have it, with all 7 guns. With one contortive spring, the lion threw himself high into the air, then fell to the ground, trembling, and lay still. When we skinned him, we found a bullet from my .45 rifle just behind his shoulder, almost over his heart, so I had killed him, and the skin was given to me. The natives were so happy they were almost crazy. They danced and shouted, laughed and sang. All the while the lion was being skinned. They heaped abuses on the dead carcass, and added insult to injury by recounting over and over how neatly we had trapped the old rascal, and how ridiculous he looked now he had lost his skin. Vengeance was sweet to these simple people. We camped in the amphitheater that night, and the next morning before daybreak started back toward the home crawl. It had taken us 2 days to get the lion, but by taking shortcuts that the natives knew, we were able to return to the Pondomesis in less than a day. Towards noon, we ran across a large herd of wild ostriches. We could not stop to capture them, but I had one of the natives promise to keep track of their movements. When we arrived at the Pondomessi kraal, we entered in a sort of triumphal march, carrying the skin proudly. The good news spread quickly, and soon natives were pouring in from every point of the compass. Then the celebration began, because of the superstition that the spirit of Gafu was in the lion. These people expected word every hour that their enemy's chief was dead. The celebration was a combination of a barbecue and a revival meeting. The king had goats and cattle and sheep and chickens killed. These were dressed and rolled in clay and laid in a pit full of hot stones. When the meat was thoroughly roasted, the shell of clay was cracked off, and the quarters of beef, legs of lamb, and roast birds were piled high before the king, who sat on a nicely tanned cowhide and served his guest. Each of the 3,000 or 4,000 natives attending the festival was given a new fiber mat from which to eat, and the public love feast began. The king did not eat. He was the host. In return for the king's hospitality, everyone gave him presents. Then the dancing began. There were dances of every kind, many of them improvised. The most important event of the evening was a magnificent war dance. The natives sang in weird harmony and played their 3-stringed guitars far into the night. There was a bright moon, and its light, and the light of the fires, threw giant shadows from the dancers. The great warrior, who had proved obstreperous at Kilkenny, led the war dance. He stood almost a head above his fellows, and they themselves were big men. When the dance was over, and the others had thrown themselves, exhausted, to the ground, he seemed as fresh as ever. For a moment he stood alone in the circle of faces, the firelight gleaming upon him. Then he struck up a dance of his own, throwing himself fiercely about, leaping high into the air, swinging his assegai around and around his head, and making low guttural noises. He retreated and advanced before the king. Mtenzo and I, who were sitting one on each side of the king, were the guests of honor, for we had killed the lion. This was what made the great warrior jealous, as Mtenzo explained. This enormous native was telling the king all the things he had done in battle, and the king was bowing in acknowledgment. The warrior wanted to impress upon the king that killing a lion was nothing. He could kill lions bare-handed. He was saying, "It isn't right to make peace with these Pondos. Next time you want lions killed, send for me. I'm a great warrior." The king was a diplomat. Therefore he bowed and smiled, bowed and smiled. The natives drank great quantities of Kafir beer, and ate and ate. They were still celebrating when we went at dawn to bed. Chapter 21. A chapter on death. Before we left, the king of the Pondomesis gave Mtenzo and me presents of skins and carved ivory. He also entrusted us with several fine horses, which he wished us to present to Sagao Faku on our return to Kalkeni. He was so grateful for the aid the Pondos had given him in killing the lion, and for the very liberal terms he had received at the hands of the Pondo king, that he had decided to swear allegiance to Sagao Faku, thus joining the two tribes under the one leader. On our return to Kalkeni, we carried news of the successful hunt and of the forthcoming coalition of the two tribes. Sagao Faku was greatly pleased, as were all his subjects. The good news spread rapidly, and soon all Pondo land was celebrating and feasting. The natives awaited with excitement the arrival of the king of the Pondomesis. My joy was short-lived. I had been at Kalkeni less than a week when a messenger arrived from Port St. John's, carrying this letter. "Captain Dean, the Pedro Gorino is at anchor here in the harbor. Captain Peter Benjamin lies aboard her sick with the fever. Our trip has been one of misfortune, although we had some luck in our whaling in the Mozambique Channel. On our return, we ran into a bad squall near Cape St. Andrew. A southeaster hit us square on the port before we could reef, and we lost the new sails, with which you rigged her. We are using the old ones again, and they are in pretty bad shape. Then, just out of Delagoa Bay, we were overhauled by a British man-of-war, and were made to show our papers. This, with other delays and annoyances at the hands of the British, has eaten up much of the profits. Now Captain Benjamin is raving with fever. Please come at once, respectively, Will Braithwaite, officer in command." I saw that it would be necessary to go to Port St. John's, and perhaps sail the Pedro Gorino into Cape Town. I told the king and his counselors just how matters stood, and they agreed that there was no other course. Before leaving, I had Sagao Faku and Mtenzo promise that should I never return, the mission and schools would be completed just as if I were there. The king, however, clung to the hope that I could return before the next rainy season. He was so sad that at first I thought of taking him with me. It was forgetful of me even to think of it. I had forgotten that since the annexation of Pondoland to Cape Colony, his status was virtually that of a prisoner of war. His every move was watched with suspicion, and should I have taken him on a journey to Cape Town, it would have endangered his country and given the English an excuse for new atrocities. I hurriedly gathered together my luggage, and with Mtenzo, Sagao Faku's 9-year-old son, and several natives for companions, on the first leg of my journey, mounted and galloped away toward Port St. John's. When we reached the St. John's River, we followed its valley, which cuts deeper and deeper as it approaches the sea. By the time we reached the harbor, we were between hills which rise over 1,000 feet on each side of the river. The country here was clothed with dense subtropical vegetation of a deep glossy green, broken now and again with the brighter colors of birds and flowers. When I saw the Pedro Gorino lying at anchor, I was anxious to go aboard and once more feel the deck beneath my feet. I signaled for a boat and was soon being rowed across the waters of the harbor. Even before we reached her side, I could see that the ship had seen rough weather. This, and the fact that my good friend Peter Benjamin was sick with the fever, filled me with despondency. Braithwaite hailed me across the water, but when I had clambered aboard, we scarcely hesitated long enough to greet each other. Instead, we hurried to the cabin to see Peter Benjamin. He was delirious, and he did not recognize me. He rolled and tumbled in his berth, crying, "Ahoy, ahoy!" or "Sally a drink, girl." Again he would sing bits of a chanty, or groan most pitifully. "Has he had any attention?" I asked. Braithwaite seemed a little hurt, as he assured me that Benjamin had been given quinine and all the other simple remedies for fever, together with every care. I could see that there was only one chance for his recovery, and that was a quick run for Cape Town. I went ashore, carrying with me all the suitable presents I could find in the cargo aboard the boat. These I presented to Mtenzo and my native friends. I then wrote a farewell letter to the king, telling him that I had not forgotten his kindness, nor the beauty of his country, and promising some day to return to Cow Kenny. Segow's little son, who had ridden all the way with the ability of a mature horseman, broke down and cried when he learned that I was really leaving. Great tears rolled down his shiny black face, and he was only to be consoled by the largest stick of candy I could purchase in Port St. John's. Because of the extreme necessity of reaching Cape Town, we put to sea that evening and bowled along under full sail. The night was clear, and as we sailed, Will Braithwaite told me the story of the ship's voyaging since I had last been aboard. At every port, the officials had delayed the papers. The cargoes from Da Costa at Delagoa Bay and from Freighter and Elliot at Cape Town had been decreasing steadily. The storm, which had taken the new set of sails, had also washed away a considerable amount of whaling gear and damaged the superstructure we had built in the waist. Not the least depressing was Will Braithwaite's deep and mournful voice. There was a feeling about the ship hard to define, a feeling of foreboding. It came over me like a spell. I wished to shake myself free. Although the weather was warm, the white moonlight on the deck seemed as cold as winter in the mountains. The wind went sighing through the rigging like the voices of departing spirits. Before the night had passed, the sky had clouded over. Day after day, the world grew darker. Each man in the crew felt death hanging over the ship, and never passed the cabin except in fear. What evil spirits might be lurking about us? They rolled their big eyes, as if they could smell death. The sharks followed us day and night. Gulls, uttering hoarse cries, stormed about us. Peter Benjamin grew continually worse. In spite of all we could do, he raved and lost consciousness. I attended his many hours each day, and often sat up with him through the long watches of the night. Once, in a rational moment, he asked to be buried on an island where he could hear the swishing of the waves on the shore. He had been born on an island, and he loved the sea. He told me bits of his childhood and his early life aboard ship. Then he lost consciousness again and began singing broken bits of song. Often I could not understand the words or make out the tune. Then, as if he had found one with more meaning than the rest, his voice cleared to its customary deep, bell-like tone, and he burst forth singing the chanty sailors sing at landfall when the journey is almost over. Only one more day a reefin', one more day, oh rock and roll me over, only one more day. Peter Benjamin knew as well as we that he was about to die. I hoped for his sake that it might happen before he reached Cape Town, so that he might be buried at sea or upon an island as he had wished. But as we drew nearer and nearer Cape Town, we saw that he might last until we got him ashore, and we hoped against hope that some great doctor might save him. Upon dropping anchor in Table Bay, we hurried him to a hospital where the diagnosis was black water fever and a weak heart. I came to see him every day, but it was evident that he was growing weaker. On the third morning I asked the doctor what chances he had, if any. He replied callously, "There's no use fooling with a patient with a heart like that. He's been dying for 20 years. The next day we received word that Benjamin was dead. We arranged for a fine funeral. Every man aboard the ship bought a top hat, a Prince Albert coat, and black crape for mourning. It was attended by the crew and a great many Africanado and European friends, including the old Scotchman, Mr. Frater and Mr. Elliot. Altogether there must have been 175 of us marching behind the hearse. He was buried from Will Braithwaite's house, and after the ceremony we marched the whole length of Hanover Street and out to the cemetery. Since he was an African, his death was soon forgotten, except by his friends aboard the ship. A year later, another funeral in Cape Town attracted worldwide notice because it was for a conqueror of Africa instead of one of her sons. Cecil Rhodes, grandiose and pompous in life, could scarcely have been expected to be simple and unassuming in death. Until his physicians had insisted upon a change of climate, he had remained at his estate, the magnificent Grote Shore. Then he had been borne to the seashore, where it was hoped that the lower altitude might aid his heart, but money was unavailing at the last, and he died, proving himself no more immortal than the thousands of poor natives who had died at his hands. What did it avail him that he had been able to trick an old chief out of an Aladdin's cave full of diamonds, gold, and rare skins in return for a few 100 guns which would not shoot? What did all his confiscations and annexations, his wide estates and unlimited wealth avail him? It is said that his brother killed himself in Central Africa by getting drunk during an attack of the fever, which so befuddled his poor brain that he poured a keg of alcohol over himself and lit a match. Cecil Rhodes was no less a victim of his vices. He was an imperialist to the last, and at his own suggestion his burial was the very symbol of imperialism. He was drawn up Adderley Street on a gun carriage, drawn by black horses and draped with flags. A retinue of thousands followed him to his grave in the Matopa Hills, up in Matabeleland. Here, by an order he had given before his death, he was placed in a great cement crypt, weighing thousands of pounds, poured into a cave blasted from the solid granite. Thus his body might never be removed from the country he had conquered, and his iron spirit might continue to subdue the Ethiopian race even after he was gone. This was the last grandiose gesture of an African conqueror, whose cruelty was only equalled by that of Henry the Navigator. Yet 6 months afterwards, since Africa is a warm country, he was no more, in the eyes of nature, than Peter Benjamin, remembered only by his shipmates.